Welcome to another teaching in our series, Godly Living in an Ungodly World. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about leadership and raising up leadership. This is a very crucial thing for the church today, and I think that many times it's not done very well. So I'd like to share some thoughts about this process of identifying and raising up leaders. When we think of leaders and raising up leaders, we generally use these criteria. Are they gifted? Are they willing to serve? And are they available? These qualities, though important, have a fatal flaw. That is, they say nothing about the character or maturity of the person. The Lord is always interested in character over ability. To quote the Bible teacher Graham Cooke, those people will destroy with their character what they have built with their gifts. People who follow this type of leader run the danger of being used, embittered towards the church, or even destroyed. It is sort of like seeing a lifeboat, and when you try to use it in time of crisis, it either collapses or you get in and find it full of holes. The leader themselves find that when needs come up and these people need answers and succor, and they don't have the character or maturity to supply what is needed, they often end up disillusioned and embittered also. A lot of times they will hide behind an authority barrier because they really don't have the ability to do what is needed. Now, there are levels of leadership that come with various degrees of authority, responsibility, and accountability. The lowest level would be what I would call a supervisor. This is someone who leads others in a very specific task. Anyone can be put in a supervisory role. It is an excellent way to test people to see what gifting and abilities are present. This is in line with the principle that Jesus reveals in Luke 16:10. It is the principle of little and much. It says that he who is faithful in little will be faithful in much, and that the reverse is also true. People who are going to be leaders must first demonstrate that they know how to lead, and that they are faithful in every task, no matter how small or ordinary. This builds and demonstrates character in a person. I believe that real leaders are not made, but are called of God. Offices don't make leaders. Leaders are raised up to fill offices. The Lord chooses whom he wants, gifts them with faith and ability, and puts them in place where he wants them to be. 1 Samuel 16:7 is a very familiar story. It tells us the story of David's selection as king by Samuel the prophet. The Lord told Samuel that he doesn't look on outward appearances, but he looks at the heart when he chooses a leader. Only God knows the heart of man, and only God knows the future and what he has planned. Leadership principles and methods can be taught and refined, but only the Lord's calling creates real leaders. This is one of the giftings from the Lord that we are encouraged to seek out and move in. A reading of Romans 12:1-8 will give you an idea how this happens. Now, for every leader, there must be those who are faithful followers. Here's a question. Which is more important, faithful leaders or faithful followers? I'll leave that question for your meditation. Actually, it's not a question of importance, but more one of roles and service. Many people strive to be recognized as a leader because they like the apparent status, recognition, and what they see as the perks that go with leadership. I believe these folks lack a true understanding of the other half of leadership, which is responsibility, the spiritual tax, and accountability that goes along with leadership. How can we then identify the true God-called leaders? What characteristics will their lives demonstrate? Jesus was always surrounded by many people who followed him, so it is obvious that he selected some to lead. In Luke chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, we see that Jesus went aside and he prayed all night. And when he came back, he named the 12 apostles. Obviously, the first step is to seek the Lord in prayer for his guidance. If he appoints them and places them as he wishes, we better ask. I can tell you from experience there can be many surprises when we do this. We might think, who them? This is because many will be diamonds in the rough who will need much polishing before they can assume the role God has for them. Now, what characteristics would we expect to see in those who will be called to leadership? What sort of attitudes would they begin to demonstrate in their lives? First one, in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, says, "But he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. For not he who commends himself is approved, but he whom the Lord commends." They have the Lord's commendation on their life. When they lead, people follow and recognize God's given authority. They don't have to beat them over the head or cajole them. They'll just have people who will follow them because this is part of the anointing that goes on leadership. Number two, 1 Timothy 3:6 says they should not be a novice, lest being puffed up with pride they fall into the same condemnation as the devil. People, they must have maturity and not be a novice or a newcomer. A mature person has largely settled the who am I and why am I issues. They may not understand everything, but they have a solid understanding of their relationship with God, so maturity is an attitude we look for. Number three, Matthew 20, verses 25 to 28. Jesus called them to himself and said, "You know the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whosoever desires to be great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." You want to look for attitudes of humility, and they must be willing to be a servant. And number four, 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul said, "Imitate me, as I also imitate Christ." Their life must reflect the Christ who lives within them. People who follow leaders will try to imitate them, so it's important that they are showing the correct way to live. If we aren't willing to do it, how can we ask others to do it? The issue of how to raise up, train, and release leaders is a broad one, with many different ideas and plans around. In some ways, it parallels raising children. It always starts with a relationship. It seems to me that the basic question when raising up and discipling leaders are these ones. What are we trying to see created? And whose plan are we following? And whose training program are we using? There are at least two possibilities when we answer these questions. Are we creating, shaping, molding, and not training based on what we think, and training based on what we think? Or are we working according to God's plan for that individual? The basic difference is knowing the difference between manipulation and nurturing. When you manipulate something, you have a specific end in your mind, and we bend and shape and control to see them become what we think they should be. A bonsai tree is an extreme example of manipulation. When you nurture someone, you find out what the thing is supposed to be according to what it was created to be, and do the things that encourage it to fulfill that destiny. Gardening is a good example of this. All plants in the garden may be vegetables, but each one can and does need different care to become fruitful. God's plan for nurture is based upon His omnipotence, His omnipresence, and His omniscience. He knows the heart, and He knows the plan, and His Spirit will supply an individual school of the Spirit plan. Man's plan will be based on our observation, our knowledge and experience, and our abilities and strengths. Now the Lord will use those things in His plan of nurturing, but He must be in control, not us. After all, they are His and not ours to do with as we have desire or need. Just as the military does, there needs to be some basic training for all. There are certain skills that all Christians need before they can proceed very far into what they are called for. And we need to make sure that they have these basic things mastered before they take on any kind of leadership position. Paul warns Timothy not to raise up any novices for this very reason. How then did Jesus train and raise up His disciples and leaders? Books and books and books have been written on this subject, and there's much teaching on this. I just like to point out a few principles concerning this subject of how he trained his leaders. First of all, he used personal interactions combined with a personal call. He spent lots and lots of time interacting with his disciples. He loved them without reservation. To raise up leaders is a time-consuming thing. Number 2, he used teachings. Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, is a good example of how he taught and shared with his disciples. Number 3, he used impartation by supplying opportunities for them to minister in the same way he was ministering. A good examples can be found in Luke chapters 9 and 10, where Jesus gave authority to and sent out the 12, and then the 70 to minister. As they were going out under our authority, what they do reflects directly on us. This stage can be very interesting. And many leaders are reluctant to do this for that very reason, because they're afraid that if they give this person authority or opportunity and they make a mess of it, it's going to reflect badly on the leader's reputation. And lastly, number 4, he finally fully commissioned and released them. Although he promised to always be available, they were on their own. This is a very important part of leadership training. There will come a time in their training when we will have to release them and let them go. If you attempt to micromanage them, you're going to lose them. If you release them just like children, then they will be your friend, and you'll have that wonderful relationship where they will come back to you for interaction and wisdom if they need help. Now finally, in closing, I'd like to leave you with a few general thoughts. When we're training people, things go from general to specific. And please remember this, that when you're working with other people's lives and destinies, this is a serious thing. Also, we need to know that people don't sort out into neat categories, so things can sometimes be pretty subjective. And sometimes things get very messy. But praise the Lord for His grace and His mercy, for His guidance and His overwhelming presence. His desire is to raise up godly men and women in leadership in His church, so that things will go forward according to His plan. And we can expect Him to help us as we give ourselves to this, to be the instruments that He uses to raise up the next generation. Finally, He leaves us a promise. In Matthew 16:18, the second part of that verse says, "And He will build His church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it."